Morning, everybody. Thanks for being on the first Coffee with Crenshaw of the year. I've got my coffee. I don't know what you're drinking, but we're going to do this about monthly, I think, and we'll always try to have a topic associated with it and have some great experts on the line with us as well. Can't wait to do these in person eventually, but I guess the good thing about a virtual town hall is, we have almost 400 people on this particular call, and it's definitely hard to get 400 people in person. So, but what we'll do is we'll do it both ways. We'll have it in person, but we'll still broadcast it as well. So as if you don't want to show up, you can still be a part of it. And especially want to thank Alex Oler with TC Energy and Robert Bell with Price Gregory for being our special guest this morning. They're going to speak to the real impact on jobs in our economy, both here in Texas and around the country, of these recent Biden administration executive actions on energy policy. And well, that's what we're here to talk about this morning. Unfortunately, there's a lot of talk of unity, a lot of talk of coming together, but that's not been the policy direction in the first few days of this administration. We've seen a lot of executive orders on a whole host of issues, and we could probably spend the whole day debating the merits of more than 50 executive orders that have been signed. But today I just want to focus on energy policy because they have the biggest impact for Texas so far. Also, if you guys look at the podcast that I do regularly, one of the more recent podcasts is a longer discussion on all of the different executive orders that were signed by Biden on the first day. So you can get a little bit more information on a more wide variety of topics there. That podcast is called Hold These Truths. You can find it on Apple. Give it 5 stars. On the first day in office, President Biden effectively canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, rejoined the Paris Climate Accord as well. Just this week, President Biden announced a moratorium, effectively a ban on new oil and gas leases on federal land and water, meaning offshore drilling. So let's take these one at a time. Canceling the Keystone pipeline takes away thousands of union jobs in America and millions of dollars in contracts for Texas in just 1 year. Get this, it'll likely hurt the environment. Keystone XL was a net zero emissions pipeline. So removing the pipeline will simply force transport of oil and gas by truck or rail, which are less safe and less environmentally friendly than pipelines. Now, Joe Biden and John Kerry have suggested that these union workers will just get different jobs. Just go get a solar job in renewable energy once the oil and gas industry disappears. But as labor data shows, solar and wind jobs pay about $20,000 less on average than oil and gas jobs. It's a pretty big financial hit for any worker, but especially those in the middle class. On the Paris Climate Agreement, we are giving a free pass to China while punishing businesses here at home who are already working to reduce emissions. So we self-impose emission reductions by more than a quarter under this agreement. China, by the way, is increasing theirs, not reaching their peak carbon output until 2030 because they're given leeway as a quote unquote developing nation. The United States has already cut emissions to 1992 levels, and that's before the pandemic. Okay, it's probably better than that now because, as you know, we sort of stopped our economy over this past year. But before all that happened, we had been consistently cutting our emissions. I mean, by record levels. In absolute terms, the United States continues to be the #1 reduction in emissions. So I think it makes a little sense to treat the second largest economy in the world, China, as a developing nation and allow them to pollute while we suffocate our job growth with additional regulations and increase our electricity and gas prices. Banning oil and gas drilling on federal lands will be the biggest blow for Texas. The drilling ban on federal lands and waters could cost the oil and gas industry up to 1 million jobs nationally by 2022, including 120,000 jobs in Texas. Global energy demand is set to increase by 25% over the next 20 years. And I want to say that again. Energy demand over the next 20 years will increase by 25%. That fact does not change. As it turns out, there's a lot of poor people in a lot of different countries that actually don't want to be poor anymore. And the #1, really the only way to get out of poverty in the modern world, or really any time in history, is to have energy, to power your industry, to power your home, to do anything. Okay, so that's going to increase. You could probably argue it might even increase more than 25%. And so if we restrict our oil and gas production, what are we doing? We are ceding energy dominance to countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia that don't adhere to the same environmental regulations we do, or labor regulations, by the way. And that demand won't change. So Therefore, neither will global emission levels. It is a high-cost proposition with no environmental benefits. So this week I wrote a letter to President Biden demanding answers as to the legal authority he used to implement this moratorium unilaterally. Congress has passed laws that require leases to be reviewed and approved in a timely manner by the Department of Interior. We don't believe that President Biden has the unilateral authority to halt leases on federal land without clear direction from Congress. To also introduce legislation that would require at least 2 area-wide leases sales per year on available acreage in the Western and Central Gulf of Mexico. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act currently directs the Secretary of Interior to establish a schedule for lease sales on the Outer Continental Shelf, but does not mandate the number of lease sales the department is required to hold. Legislation changes that and would overrule the Biden executive order if it were to be signed into law. My bill is called the Conservation Funding Protection Act because energy production provides critical funding for coastal conservation and hurricane preparedness. In some states like New Mexico, by the way, it also provides funding for schools and many other social services. And people in New Mexico are freaking out a little bit about it. I'll be working to move that bill forward and expect it to receive bipartisan support in Congress. And, listen, we're in the minority by a slim margin, but there are some Democrats that do believe that this stuff needs to happen, and hopefully we can make it work. So here's the bottom line. I reject the notion that we can't combat climate change without hurting our economy and energy sector. I've been calling for solutions to climate change since I took office. But I'm sure you are all sick and tired of this false choice of inaction or job-killing regulations when it comes to the climate change debate. We have to focus on solutions that work, like carbon capture, proven technology we use right here in Texas, just here in the Houston area, to reduce emissions from natural gas plants. 2 bipartisan bills I introduced to boost carbon capture technology were signed into law at the end of last year. Nuclear energy is the only zero emissions baseload energy source, meaning it can power industrial projects, cities, et cetera, in a consistent way without the intermittency that you might see with solar and wind. It's the only thing we have available that is net zero emissions. Wind and solar just don't generate enough power for manufacturing. We should expand the use of nuclear and continue to innovate in nuclear energy technology. Bill Gates is a leading expert in nuclear energy and a big advocate for its use. He says with innovations in nuclear power, we can create a new generation of nuclear energy that would be safer, produce less water or less waste, and be lower cost. There's also bipartisan bills we can work on to help reduce emissions without hurting jobs or our economy. This year, I'll sit on the Environment and Climate Change Subcommittee of the powerful Energy and Commerce Committee, where there are dozens of bills that Republicans and Democrats can work to pass to achieve this shared goal. So undermining Texas energy jobs is an unacceptable byproduct, I think, of President Biden's energy policy so far. If he's willing to put those proposals on hold and work with Congress on bipartisan solutions to protect the environment while protecting the livelihoods of my constituents, I'll be happy to be an advocate for that agenda. With that, we'll get to questions. I look forward to answering them. But first, I want to turn it over to Alex for an intro before we dive into those questions. Alex, the floor is yours. And then Robert, we'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Appreciate being able to be with you and your constituents this morning. I know we're going to talk about the Keystone XL pipeline, an important project for TC Energy, but just one of many different things that we're doing. And I appreciated your comments on trying to address climate change and the growing energy demand. I mean, we know that people are going to continue to use energy. It's part of our way of life. The products that we use, I'm sitting in front here, a laptop with plastic in it. So these energy sources that we're all using are going to be part of our lives for a long time. And so we are focused, our company, and Keystone XL was a part of this. How do we meet that challenge of getting the energy that people need really across North America, which is where our footprint is? And how do we do it in the most environmentally responsible way with an eye toward what our future challenges are going to be from an environmental standpoint. So I'll give you just a couple of facts on our company so you and your constituents kind of know a little bit about TC Energy. We've got about 7,500 employees. We are headquartered in Canada, in Alberta. We do have an extensive presence in the US. We've got about 3,500 employees. A good number of those employees are in our downtown Houston office. We have the Keystone pipeline system, but that's really a smaller part of our business. We're more of a natural gas pipeline company, and we've got an extensive natural gas pipeline footprint across North America. We're a large transporter of natural gas in Canada and in the United States. In the US, we touch on about 40 different states in terms of where our asset bases are. We've got a presence in all of the major kind of production areas, and we're focused on moving natural gas across state lines from where it's being produced to where it is being consumed. About 25% of the natural gas demand from a continental standpoint runs through our system every given day. In fact, a lot of the natural gas that's being burned in Washington, D.C. and their surrounding area comes through our system. We operate also, in addition to the natural gas pipelines, we operate the Keystone pipeline system. Keystone XL was going to be an important addition to that system, but the Keystone system itself is in place right now. And then you mentioned nuclear power. We operate one of the largest nuclear generating facilities in Eastern Canada. So just wanted to kind of give you a flavor of the role that we play in meeting these energy challenges for the country and the continent, and just really appreciate your leadership and the attention that you bring to these issues and the opportunity to talk to you about it today. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Alex. Robert, we'll move to you and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and followed your work and really appreciate what you're trying to do for the American people. I'm Robert Bell. I'm president and CEO of a company called Price Gregory. We are a Texas-based company, but we work all over the United States. Our business focus, as well as many of our competing contractors in the space and the hundreds of thousands of our employees in our industry, our focus is to build and maintain energy transmission infrastructure that is largely responsible for providing energy and in our homes and our businesses. And much of what we transport, in addition to providing heat and electricity, it's also used to make our medical supplies, clothing, protective equipment, to include the PPE being used by our healthcare industry today, and many of the medications that Americans use. Many people may not realize that. You may also be surprised to know that our industry actually complements the renewables industry. We really don't compete. It's unfortunate that many of our politicians tend to treat them as though they compete. They're not mutually exclusive. One needs the other. Our employees are union. They're given great paying jobs with great benefits. They are given lots of training and development throughout their careers, not just when they join. Many of them join right out of high school. They're following their uncles, their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, aunts. Our industry is very diverse, unlike some of the narratives that we're receiving from the other side, unfortunately. And these jobs provide great benefits to all the people across our country. Our union brothers provide workers who are trained to work safely, productively. They take a lot of pride in providing high quality for our customers. Our industry contributes to the union managed training funds. Many people aren't aware of this, but these are world-class training funds. The United Association provides us the talent in the trade to provide welding, pipe fitting through journeyman welders and helpers. They have a world-class training facility through their 798 group in Tulsa, and we work with them a lot. The operators have a world-class training facility right here in Houston. Many may not be aware of this, but I encourage you to get online and look at it. It's used to train new workers right out of high school entering the workplace to provide great jobs. Our workers, they work on average 60 or more hours a week. If you took the average of what they work over a year, it's well over 2,000 hours per employee. The notion that our employees are temporary is completely false. They make anywhere from $9,500 a week to $3,200 a week, depending on their skill and their profession. Very, very disgusting to hear some say that these jobs are temporary. They're no more temporary than a home builder or someone building a car or a restaurant worker. It really upsets us to hear that. PGI is one of several base Texas contractors who are under contract to our customer, TC Energy or Keystone. We're excited to build the project. I'm really disappointed it was canceled by politicians who made no effort to study the attributes of the project. And I look forward to answering questions about it today, particularly about the attributes of the project. It's already been mentioned, and it's absolutely the truth, that Keystone made a commitment to build this project with good union labor. They have reached out to tribal communities. They're on board. The project is a net carbon zero, meaning that they will build the renewables energy needed to provide the power that would provide this, the power to drive the pipeline itself. And many don't realize how large a commitment this is. I encourage you to get on the website and read it. It competes with commitments made by Amazon, Google, Walmart, all of them. It competes with them for the scale of what they've committed to. There's absolutely no logical reason this project has been canceled. And so I'm probably spoken too long. Dan, I'll shut up and let you go on with the questions.
All right. Thanks, Robert. It's good information. Justin, are you doing the questions that I'm answering?
Yep.
Okay. I'll let you go.
Yep. So Dan, this first one's for you. Why can't we run the entire economy on solar and wind?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it gets at the heart of a lot of misconceptions about, because here's the real debate when it comes to climate change. It's not whether climate change is happening. It's not whether we have too much CO2 emissions globally. All right. I do understand that maybe used to be the debate. It's not really the debate anymore. The debate now is, what are the solutions to that problem? All right. What's the cost benefit analysis? What's really going to happen with climate change? I mean, really, not the world's not going to end in 12 years. Okay. But what are the real costs? And then what are the costs of doing nothing? And what are the costs of, say, transitioning to the entire economy to solar and wind, or the entire world to solar and wind, or just renewables? And renewables, when people say renewables, that speaks directly to solar and wind, because the wind is renewed and the sun is renewed every day. But there's problems with something like that, okay? And people have heard me call solar and wind silly in the past. It doesn't mean I'm against it. I'm not against it. I don't want solar and wind companies to go out of business. What I'm against is this, what has become an almost religious ideology that they must take over, like renewables must take over the entire energy economy. And I call that silly because it's physically impossible. And I'll go through a little bit why. It's not practical. So first of all, we subsidize renewables to an extraordinary extent. I mean, there's some analysis showed that solar and wind get about 250 times more subsidies than nuclear does, and a heck of a lot more than say oil and gas. There's a myth out there that oil and gas gets subsidies. It's not really true. There's tax breaks in certain ways, but these are not subsidies. Because every business gets tax break. You get tax breaks as an individual when you spend money on certain things. There's a lot of talk too that Texas is a third of its energy from wind power. But listen, that's a third installed. And that doesn't refer to when the wind power is actually generating electricity. So people like to talk about how much energy, if it operated at 100%, if all of our wind in Texas, all of our wind mills in Texas operated at 100%, would be generated by wind, and pretend like that's what's happening all the time. It's not true. It's never true. So in West Texas, the wind only blows at the right speed for 19% of the time on average. And there's no predicting when that 19% of the time will be. So it's not reliable. It's intermittent energy. I supported policy last Congress that would make drastic strides in improving battery storage, which is something that is desperately needed if we ever want to support wind and solar on scale. But even then, I mean, there's a theoretical limit to how much you can store in a battery, and we're not even at that theoretical limit yet, just with our technology that we currently have. And even if we were, you'd be talking about mass amounts of space to have those batteries, and a lot of mining and rare earth minerals to make those batteries in the first place. It's not even clear that we have that much rare earth minerals on Earth. So unless something changes, like the rules of physics, a solar and wind takeover is just literally impossible. You also have to understand something else. How do you manufacture steel or make jet fuel? You need to have these things. And these are real questions, and they have yet to be solved, and they'll never be solved by solar and wind. They're not baseload powers. You can't spin them up when you want them, when you need energy. So you always have to have something like nuclear, natural gas, or oil on the side to actually have a baseload energy. And even if you have that energy at the time, it will never be enough to actually reach the energy levels you need to power industry. That's a really important point as well. I would also point out a couple other things. Space matters. You know, being an environmentalist is more than just about carbon emissions. It's about the environment. It's about wildlife. It's about, look, how much acreage do we want to plow down to create a solar farm or a bunch of wind turbines? And it turns out it has to be a lot. So we're in Houston. Let me put it this way. You would have to basically clear out everything inside the 610 loop just with solar panels, just to get the amount of power that you would produce with like one nuclear plant. One nuclear plant takes up, an acre. Okay, one natural gas plant takes up maybe an acre as well, like about the same. Okay, so you see the costs and benefits there, all right? And how much more materials are needed, by the way, to cover that entire area with solar panels? Like a heck of a lot more materials. I mean, it's obvious. And then you have to build those materials out in China, because China is the only place with lax environmental regulations and lax labor laws. That's why they can afford to manufacture all of those solar panels and wind turbines, and they ship them across the ocean into the Houston Ship Channel. We see it all the time. We're watching big wind turbines come from the Houston Ship Channel, go out to West Texas. Again, it's fine, I'm not against it, but we have to at least be honest about what's really happening here in this manufacturing process. They're mining tons and tons of rare earth minerals out in China, emitting huge amounts of carbon just to do that, which, by the way, is not calculated into the overall carbon footprint of these technologies. So look, I'm not against them. I just look at them with both eyes wide open. Well, one eye wide open, if you catch my drift. But I'm just honest about it. And I think we all need to be a lot more honest about it. All right, back to you, Justin.
All right, Robert, this next question's for you. If they're building the Keystone pipeline in Canada and Montana, why are they hurting jobs in Texas?
Why are they hurting jobs in Texas?
Yeah, why is canceling the Keystone pipeline hurting jobs in Texas?
Well, I would estimate there are probably a third of the workers that would end up, maybe not a third, maybe between a sixth and a third of the workers and families who will be employed on the project will actually come from Texas. Many of the support bases for contractors who are under contract with Keystone, they're based right here in Houston. U.S. Pipeline, Associated, Mercer, PBEN, there are many, many contractors whose families and their actual businesses are based right here in the Houston area. And there are other businesses as well. Support industry is very large in this space. I encourage people to look into it. It's quite a story.
Okay, thank you. Alex, question for you here. What evidence is there that the Keystone pipeline is a safety hazard that must be shut down? Was it really that bad for the environment?
Well, we certainly would argue no on both counts. I mean, the decision that was made kind of focused on climate change and the the United States ability to be perceived as a world leader on climate, which is, I think, the rationale for revoking the cross-border permit. Safety and environment are hugely important issues for us and for this project. I mean, those were two major focal points. From a safety standpoint, in the United States, interstate pipelines are regulated by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And we have a very comprehensive soup to nuts pipeline safety code that manages materials, constructions, operation, inspection. The Keystone pipeline, we designed it specifically to not only meet those safety standards, but exceed them in a number of areas. There was about 51 separate conditions where the pipeline was going to go above and beyond the already high and comprehensive federal safety standards. So the safety of the pipeline was not really an issue, we don't think, or should not have been. There's also this issue that, you know, this is energy that is in demand in the United States. And that was part of our thinking with Keystone XL. We want to meet energy demand today. And we want to, you know, we have an eye toward whatever we are transitioning to in the future and want to be a part of that in solving those problems. But as this energy is being demanded and in use and coming to the United States anyway, a lot of it, if it's not coming by pipeline, is coming by rail or by truck. So in some instances, it's shipped from countries overseas. And so our contention is that a pipeline is the safest and most efficient way and the most environmentally friendly way to bring it into the United States. And just a quick point on the environment, I think Robert touched on this a little bit, and we've been talking a lot about renewable power. You know, to operate a pipeline, it takes a tremendous amount of electricity. This pipeline proposal, Keystone XL, was going to be the first of its kind to have those operational power needs met by renewable power. So the emissions of the pipeline would be zero, not net zero, but actual zero, which was a groundbreaking proposal in our industry. The other thing is, there's been a lot of attention from an environmental standpoint on the product that's in the pipe, and in particular, the production that happens upstream in Western Canada. There's been a tremendous amount of work by producers upstream. The Canadian government has been involved in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as part of that production area. When a third party has kind of looked at where we stand today compared with years ago, in 2015, 2014, when the Keystone XL pipeline was reviewed by, it was then the Obama administration. They did a really monumental environmental study on the project. And this group came in and they wanted to look at the changes, knowing that emissions have been falling in the production area in Western Canada, and knowing that the pipeline itself would be operated at zero in terms of emissions. They looked at this together compared with the findings from that 2014-2015 report. And the conclusion is that there would be about a 41% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So there's really a significant improvement. And if you think about how do we meet the energy needs we have today with an eye toward our future energy needs, building a pipeline for energy security reasons, to further link the US and Canada, for job creation reasons, to meet those energy needs today, but to do it in a way that is powered by renewables and really understands that emissions upstream have fallen quite considerably. That this is really kind of the way, almost the gold standard really of how to do these kind of major infrastructure projects going forward. So, you know, we were on the right track here. We think there was a tremendous amount of merit, just as Robert talked about in his opening remarks to the project. But the administration here just chose to go in a different direction.
All right, thank you. Dan, this next one's for you. Why aren't we funding research into better ways of reducing CO2, like removal and sequestration or nuclear? Betting on only solar and wind is a big mistake.
Great question. Gets back to the solutions, right? If we agree that there's a problem, then the next question is, okay, well, what are the solutions then? What makes sense, especially on a cost-benefit analysis? And you know, I kind of want to frame what Alex was just saying, and as well. So going back a little bit, but the problem with the thinking right now is that it really is all or nothing. I mean, everything he just said just goes to show that it's like, no matter how clean you make this process, no matter how well you build this infrastructure, what I call pseudo-environmentalists are never happy. And that's a real problem because it shows that there's just no room for compromise here. I mean, we're not acknowledging basic facts about the demand for energy, what kind of energy is needed, what America and the world needs to continue living the way that we supposedly want to live, I would think. And we're not having a rational conversation, because if the answer is still no, then it's like, well, now it doesn't seem like there's any incentive for some of these companies to even build that next clean technology, because if they're not even sure if the government's just going to shut it down all of a sudden, that's a really bad place to be, especially from a policymaking position. Okay, so let me answer your question now. Why don't we fund other better ways to reduce CO2, like removal and sequestration and nuclear? Well, good question. It's like you teed me up for this, because I passed 2 bills last Congress that were signed into law, and both are on carbon capture and utilization. So 2 different but similar related issues. It's great technology, and we should be supporting a lot more of it. There's no reason, again, this kind of gets back to what Alex was saying. If we can make what our processes net zero, or in the case of that pipeline, 0, then why are we opposing it? Right? Because I thought the whole point was to decrease carbon emissions. But it does seem to me like many on the pseudo-environmentalist left, their point is to actually just keep it all in the ground, whether it's doing harm or not, whether we've actually achieved 0 emissions or not. And now you have to question what the real intent here is. Okay, what is the intent here? And maybe it's hard to explain, because it's almost religious in its nature. So solutions matter. And if we're offering these solutions that I thought supposedly got us where we all wanted to be, then that should be a really good thing. We've been working with the University of Houston. They've been studying for this problem for a really long time. And they've also come to the same conclusion, that our policies need to be based on emissions, not necessarily fuel, which kind of gets to my point here. So just hating fossil fuels for no reason it doesn't make any sense. Nuclear, again, like why was the Green New Deal against nuclear? This is a proven technology, 0 emissions. You can fit a nuclear plant, again, on an acre or 2. I think people have a strange vision of nuclear too often. Like they imagine some sort of green, toxic neon sludge like coming out of the plant. It's just not true. Like nuclear waste is actually, it's like in a cylinder like this, and then they stick it in a mountain underground, and it's fine. It's perfectly fine. Been using it for decades and decades and decades. So why don't we use more of it? If we're going to be using taxpayer dollars on something like, in this case, solar and wind credits, then maybe we should be looking at the technologies that can provide baseload and more power for Americans, and still be safe and carbon free. Just real quick on the carbon capture and sequestration, the bills I'm looking that we passed on that are fairly simple. Look, it's adding funding to pilot programs and research and development for 2 things. Carbon capture, so looking at more technologies like we have just outside here in Houston, where there's actually a natural gas plant. It creates electricity from natural gas, but has net 0 emissions because of that, because they use the CO2 emitted from that process and recycle it to power the actual processing plant. Pretty incredible. Not sure how they do it, but they do it. The next question is, technologically speaking, how do we expand that out? How do we scale that out in bigger ways, make it affordable? We also have to be looking at CO2 as a commodity and not a waste product. If we start to look at it like a commodity, well, it turns out there's a lot of things that CO2 can be used for. Maybe it's cement production, maybe it's other oil extraction. Either way, there's a lot of things it can be used for. And if we start to create a market for that, or at least not even create it, we just allow it to happen, because it will happen naturally. And if we remove that regulatory burden on it, you will find that companies will start to investigate that technology, engage in research and development, and start to capture carbon and sequester it, really because it's profitable for them. So we can create those incentives.
All right, thanks, Dan. Robert, this next one is for you. How will President Biden's moratorium on drilling permits affect the Houston energy industry long term? If it's made permanent, will our jobs move internationally?
Well, I'm not a macro expert when it comes to the oil and gas industry. I have to confess, I will tell you that there are millions of jobs that are related in some fashion to the energy industry in oil and gas. And anything that is done that slows the effort or makes it more expensive to explore and to exploit energy resources on lands held by the government. And it only serves I mean, it's just logical. You would think that the cost of the commodity in whatever form it is, either natural gas or oil or whatever use downstream from that derives, the cost of that is going to increase. And so ideally, and these are also good paying jobs. And right now, jobs, we haven't really said much about this yet, but I don't know if everybody's heard this, but jobs are pretty short right now. And I don't understand the rationale that there has to be one side win and one side lose when it comes to our professions. We need to embrace the idea that all jobs are precious, and the energy industry, they're well trained, they're professional. There's no sense in this vision that there can't be that industry. There can only be in a competing industry. I don't understand that. It's not logical. I meandered a bit, but
No, that was,
but it
that was
will.
a,
And as far as jobs going overseas, I think that the need for oil and gas globally will not go away based on what policies our politicians make or fail to make here in the States. We compete on a global basis for all of our products, our food, our medicines, our efforts, all those compete on a world stage. So to think that whatever efforts we make here that could potentially make us less competitive or somehow good, again, it's not logical. We need to be honest with the American people and start teaching them, you know, about how the world works. We have to compete, and we're not on the same playing field with all countries.
Well, thanks, Robert. Alex, this next one's for you. We kind of already went over this a little bit, but maybe you could expand on it. Why does it have to be fossil fuels versus clean jobs? Why can't it be both?
Well, it should be both. I think, you know, I think you're hearing a lot of that from the congressman, from Robert. You know, I'm watching a lot of the chat that's going on right now. I think, you know, this notion of all of the above when it comes to energy is kind of a cliche. People talk about it a lot, but there's a lot of sense to it. I mean, we need, people are going to continue to demand energy. So we should, you know, companies, researchers, et cetera, should be inspired to try to help kind of meet that demand with existing, you know, improving existing technologies, coming up with new technologies. I think, you know, when I think about kind of fossil fuels and a cleaner environment, things like that, one thing that comes to my mind is the tremendous progress that the U.S. has made in reducing climate emissions as we've produced a tremendous amount of natural gas in this country. If you look at the natural gas production expansion that's happened in the United States, a lot of that natural gas has gone onto the electric grid to generate electricity. And what we've seen is that as gas has come on, coal-fired electricity has come off, and there's been an incredible benefit to the country in terms of climate emissions reduction. And we've been really leading the world in that. Wind and solar renewables have played a part in that too. That is absolutely true. People should think about the partnership between those two fuel sources. And I think that the congressman mentioned this earlier in our conversation, that when you have renewable power that is not generating the amount of electricity that you need, maybe when you need it, you need to have a backup supply. Natural gas is the natural partner to renewables like that. So we need to be thinking, policymakers, energy companies, we need to be thinking about using all of these resources together. The last thing that I'll say, it's not only been an emissions drop here in the US, as we've been exporting LNG, as we've been exporting natural gas across the world, which is important to Texas. Certainly, you've seen countries, and Mexico is a good example. There's been gas that's been produced in Texas. It's gone down into the Mexican economy. They've put it on their electric grid, and that has resulted in fewer emissions than we would otherwise see. So it's not only progress here at home through natural gas, but you're seeing it around the world. And so I think generally we need to look at what's working and keep doing that as we're trying to kind of improve to the next generation and next phase of energy.
All right, thanks, Alex. Dan, this one's for you. The current administration has stated an initiative to replace current federal vehicles with electric vehicles in the United States. While this may sound good from the administration's political ambition standpoint, where will the funding come from, not only for the vehicles, but for the immense electrical infrastructure that would be needed to charge this fleet of vehicles? In other words, how do we protect the American taxpayer from footing the entire bill for this initiative?
Great question. You can't protect the taxpayer from this. It's absurd on its face. I mean, because, last time I checked, I think military vehicles would be included in federal vehicles. Maybe there's an exclusion for that. That would make sense, of course. But even if there's not, even if you're just talking about the black Suburbans that you see driving around DC all the time, this isn't really feasible just from a practical standpoint. But then you have to talk about what your question is, which is the cost to it and the infrastructure that you'd have to build, the billions of dollars to create charging stations for this. And again, I always bring it back to, like, just take a step back and wonder about, what do we get out of this? What do we get out of this action? Nothing. You will get nothing out of this action. The environment will not be helped even a little bit. Not even a little bit. The federal government's purchase of vehicles isn't so big that it's going to dramatically change the trajectory of research and development and manufacturing when it comes to the electrical vehicle space. It's just not. We're always going to have a mix, I think, in America, and that's okay. It doesn't change the overall trajectory of the problem. And again, I'm always going to go back to that. What do we get out of this thing? It's worth pointing out, like, even if America met its goals in the Paris Climate Accord, what do you get out of that? Well, you get like a tenth of a degree change in 100 years. That's what you get out of this. That's not a great payoff, guys, for the massive amount of cost. Now, again, it's not a bad goal to have, but we can get there through innovation. We can get there through some of the options that I've been talking about, instead of just taking a hammer to the system like in this case, right? Let's just say that federal vehicles are not going to use gas anymore. Okay. Well, it makes you feel good. Makes you feel like you're virtue signaling to the people who want this, but it doesn't do anything. And we got to remember too, there's billions of dollars paid in tax revenue at the local, state, and federal level by oil and gas companies. And the taxpayer is going to have to make up the difference for those revenues as well. So it's not just the cost of the infrastructure you're talking about and buying all those new vehicles, that's taxpayer money. It's also the revenue that you lose from oil and gas. So on the local level, these revenues pay for education, they pay for hospitals. Again, I was talking about New Mexico earlier. The vast majority of their education system is funded by one congressional district that was just banned from any new leases or sales or drilling. That's a really big deal.
Yep. Robert, this one's for you. It says, I'm an owner of some mineral rights which involves fracking on private land. I am worried that the Biden administration will ban it for private lands. What do you think might happen related to fracking on private land?
Well, I hope they don't do it. I hate to oversimplify my response, but it would be a tragic mistake to ban fracking. There's nothing to fear from fracking. It is a process safely used and cleanly used to extract oil and gas and other minerals from the ground. There's nothing to fear from it. They do a good job of, the energy industry at large does a good job of this, and they do it well. And I think that it's largely responsible for our country becoming energy independent, for our energy prices being lower than almost any other country in the world. It's just absolutely silly to think the word fracking is somehow a bad word. It's a remarkable infrastructure, and there's many other innovations that have come from the oil and gas industry in exploration of oil and gas that are remarkable. And there are other engineering attributes that come from those efforts as well that tie to renewables. But you can't translate overnight jobs from one sector to the next. It's going to take some time to catch up. But fracking, if they were to ban fracking, it would be devastating to our ability to provide sufficient energy to power our businesses, our homes, for an affordable price. It's not the right way to go.
All right, thanks, Robert. Alex, again, you spoke to this a little bit before, but maybe expand upon it. What are projects like Keystone doing to be cleaner? Tell us how you care about the environment when you're going through the pipeline construction process.
One of the things I had mentioned earlier was sort of the safety aspect of the project and our plan to build, design, and operate the project above the already very comprehensive federal safety standards. I mean, that entire effort is really to keep the product in the pipeline, which is incredibly important. And so that's something that our company takes very seriously, that we invest a tremendous amount of money in every year to make sure that our system is running safely. And that's really an industry-wide endeavor, that all of these infrastructure companies are doing that. And we, as an industry, we are trying to move toward a zero incident environment. We're not there yet, but we're close. And that's something that we're striving toward. And so I kind of include that safety notion in sort of that environmental bucket. The other thing is you talked about construction. This project and any long pipeline project, inevitably you're going to cross some sort of water resource. Well, we're able to now drill underneath those water resources at great depth. There were some major rivers that the Keystone XL pipeline was going to cross. A tremendous amount of planning was put into how we would design the pipeline just to make sure that those water resources were protected. And so it was, armoring the pipeline itself, going way underneath the riverbed. Our system is monitored 24 hours a day, really almost a second by second monitoring, so that we make sure that all of these natural resources that we have, that we love and enjoy and need to protect, rivers and lands, that they are as protected as possible. One other issue that we haven't really talked about with Keystone XL and is, a different attribute of the project, again, kind of really groundbreaking, was the partnership that we had developed with the indigenous communities. And this was in Indigenous First Nations in Canada. And then we were trying to develop this partnership, expand it from Canada into the United States with Native American communities. We were not, the pipeline itself was going through some ancestral indigenous lands. And so what we did was set aside a portion of the equity of the project, not only of the pipeline itself, but the renewable projects that would be built to power the operations. And this would help generate revenue for these indigenous communities that they're going to use for basic services. And so, it's regrettable that the project is not moving forward for all the good reasons that we talked about. But I think that, what we've shown, and something that's going to continue to drive TC Energy into the future, is, let's think about how we build these projects and how we can, truly, we're building a gas project or an oil project, and we want to utilize all of the above. We want to make sure that the project is acceptable to all the stakeholders that we're dealing with. We do believe in this idea of a more inclusive economy, and want to work with some partners that we have great respect for, but traditionally have not partnered with from a commercial standpoint, like Indigenous First Nations and Native American tribes. So, it's tough times right now that the project was canceled, but we continue to be excited about the future, for trying to tackle this challenge of delivering energy and protecting the environment.
All right, thanks, Alex. Dan, this one's for you. I'd like to understand how Biden or the public believes we can go full electric in 5 years. Additionally, I'd like it to be pointed out that even if we go electric, talking about electric vehicles, We will still need dashboards, steering wheels, levers for the chairs, etc. I just want to try to spread the word that oil is much, much more than just gasoline.
Yeah, this is a common misconception, and thanks for pointing it out. I mean, if you just look around, whatever room you're in, a lot of it is petroleum based, whether you like it or not. And that's a good thing. People are like, well, why don't we use natural products to do that? Well, because if you do, then you're just destroying the natural environment. I mean, that's why. Like, we should actually be happy that a lot of this stuff that we use every day is quote unquote man-made or unnatural, produced from a petrochemical process. That's okay. It's allowed for cleaner medical supplies. I mean, our hospitals wouldn't survive without the oil and gas industry. They never will. Plastics are okay as long as you don't throw them in the ocean. Okay, so and by the way, America is not doing that. Okay, it's a separate topic, but you know, this was put on full display not too long ago at the Houston Ship Channel, a group called the Extinction Rebellion, because they're rebelling against the extinction of the human race. Okay, I'll get to this word extinction here in a minute, actually. But the Extinction Rebellion came here and they protested on the bridge of the Houston Ship Channel, or that went over the Houston Ship Channel. And they did it by suspending themselves on the bridge using nylon ropes. That's, again, you can't make nylon without a petrochemical process. They were secured by carabiners. They were wearing windbreakers. Again, windbreakers are made with synthetic materials, petrochemical process. They also drove there. I'm not opposed to progress, okay? Look, in fact, innovation has made it so that we've ceased using ivory and started using plastic, or stopped using tortoise shells and started using, again, like a rubbery plastic material. Tortoise shells used to be used as that rubbery plastic material that we use for so many things. But do you want to kill a bunch of turtles to do that? No, you want to make it yourself. It moves people out of poverty, and improves human hygiene, and saves animals. So we have to keep looking for those kind of things, I think, that, you know, there's other things that it uses. We have companies that are looking at turning plastic into electricity, which is really interesting, or plastic into spray foam insulation, or plastic into jackets. There's a Huntsman here in Houston takes old plastic bottles and they use that to make insulation. We've been looking for ways to maybe to make it so that, because you know, we don't have a great recycling industry here in Texas. The recycling industry, by the way, it's not what people think it is, and that's a whole separate conversation. I've done podcasts on it, so please check them out. But you can make it economical. And like, this is a great example because it's a very specific, like, we need plastic bottles and they go to this specific outcome that we then sell. So making it economical is, I think, is, as opposed to just shipping tons and tons of it to China and who knows what they do with it. It seems like they might just be throwing it in the ocean. This doesn't work. And so it's really infuriating to see too, like, the hypocrisy of companies like North Face and Patagonia. North Face recently rejected an order from an oil and gas company because their jackets, well, or just because they don't like oil and gas, but it turns out like their jackets are made from oil and gas. This is just a fact. Patagonia does the same kind of virtue signaling. And here's the other thing, guys. If we don't purchase that oil and gas in the United States, we'll get it from somewhere else. And that somewhere else is probably a country that has terrible environmental regulations. One of the biggest, you know, farces of environmentalism over the last few decades is that really what we've done with our excessive environmental regulations is we just end up outsourcing our manufacturing. And then we feel good about our output, you know, our CO2 output. But the truth is that we've probably increased global emissions by doing that because we're still buying, we're still consuming. Okay, and I get, like, you know, really environmentalists are like, well, you shouldn't consume either. Okay, fine. I mean, put your money where your mouth is, John Kerry. Stop riding your private jet. That's fine. But the truth is that, like, the consumption probably isn't going to change anytime soon. This is things you can't control, but you can control the policy. And if we're outsourcing manufacturing to China that has no labor regulations, no environmental regulations, guess what? You're increasing global emissions. This is the hard truth. All right. I said I was going to get to the extinction thing. People need to understand too, the reason that this is such a heated debate and the reason some policymakers are willing to take such extreme Green New Deal action is because they're of the belief that we're going to go extinct. This is false. I would encourage you to read some great books on this subject. Apocalypse Never is a good one. Another one recently by Bjorn Lomborg. What's the name of that, Justin? His book? if you think of it, come up with it. But there's really good books on it that really go into the data and the science on really what the actual effects of climate change are going to be. And it's not quite what they say. We're not going to go extinct. There's going to be changes. There's going to be very, very slow changes. Some beachfront property in 100 years might not be beachfront property anymore. That is fine. That is a fact. Some places will rain less. Some places will rain more. Seasons might change a little bit. It'll happen all very, very, very slowly, and the human race will adapt, I think, rather well. There will be changes. We shouldn't deny that. And there's some costs associated with that, but those, but they're not quite what the alarmists are telling you. They're lying to you. They're talking about extinction. We're having kids grow up right now with mental disorders and anxiety because they're being told by lying adults that they're not going to live past age 50 because of climate change. This is really, really, this has gotten out of control. And so we got to really push back against the premise that the human race is going extinct. This is just fundamentally not true.
Yeah, Dan, that book's called A False Alarm by Bjorn Lomborg.
And both of these guys that I'm talking about are hardcore environmentalists, both of these authors. Mm-hmm. They're not Republicans. They're hardcore environmentalists that dedicated their entire life to environmentalism. And them, like me, who considers myself a rational environmentalist, are trying to focus our efforts on what will actually work, what will actually benefit us without destroying us at the same time. There's a lot of other places where our efforts would be better spent, like overfishing problems, for instance. Plastic in the oceans, I think, is a huge problem. But we've got to focus on where the problem is. It's not plastic straws in the United States. It is about 10 rivers in Asia that put 95% of the plastic in the Pacific Ocean. These are what we've got to unilaterally focus our attention on. Anyway, rant over, go to the next question.
I think this might be the last question. And Robert, I want to turn it to you. This will kind of bring it home, like down to ground level for everybody. You talked about jobs earlier, and Dan mentioned, solar and wind jobs on average pay about $20,000 less than your oil and gas jobs. Can you just talk about some of the jobs or some of the benefits workers on a project like Keystone would get, from the welders to the operators to the laborers to the truck drivers to the foremen? Can you speak to some of that, just how good these jobs are?
I can. I'll just start with the United Association, the welders, pipe fitters, journeymen, helpers. That they go to a job with a lot of training. They've personally made a lot of investment in time. They buy a very expensive vehicle equipped with tools, a welding machine. So I want to give them complete credit for all of that. It takes time and expense, and a lot of that expense is paid for by their union. So to the extent that they have the interest to become a welder and can go out and buy a rig and go to work and get trained and pass a test, they can go to work. And they'll make somewhere in the $9,000 to $9,500 per week range once they're fully trained. A welder will, or a journeyman will. And on average, they'll work 60 hours a week. In good times, they'll work every week of the year. In times that are challenged as we are now, it's less, but they're certainly not temporary. When they're working for us, we try to keep them working as long as we can. Operators are in the 6,000 per week range. Heavy equipment operators who operate equipment used to lift and move things and dig and move earth. Those operators are highly paid. They are also trained. They invest a lot of their time and efforts in furthering their training through the help of their union. Laborers just right out of high school. In fact, my son works in the industry for a competitor. We have a young man in our office who went to high school with him, who is an engineer here now. I have a nephew in the industry, works for another competing company. They all started in the industry. They made money to go to college with by being a laborer in the field, working summers. And they make anywhere from, depends on the state, somewhere between $2,500 and $3,200 a week. They're all given great benefits. The training that is available to these employees is unmatched. Teamsters is the last of the trades. They drive all of our buses, our heavy trucks that carry pipe and and materials and all sorts of things, people, and they make somewhere in the 3,000 to 4,000 per week range, depending on what they're doing. So it's a well paid industry, and they're taken care of. And whether you're union or non-union, the wages are largely similar. They're not that far different. You know, I don't want this. I mean, we're a union contractor, don't get me wrong, and I'm staunchly union, but our industry is larger than this. And I think that the movement against our industry, or on one side, unfortunately, is taking us backwards. But these are great paying jobs, a lot of good benefits. It could be a career for somebody, give them an opportunity to have a career without going broke, going to college. They can make a good living.
It's more money than I make. Some of, geez, that's what. Justin's gonna quit on me and go.
I know. I'm gonna take Robert up on a job offer.
Wow.
But Dan, that's the end of our questions. If you want to wrap up, or if anybody has kind of final thoughts here, feel free. But those were all the questions we have, and we're over our hour now. So.
Yep. Yeah, Robert, Alex, thank you so much for being on and giving us that inside industry outlook on just really what the truth on the ground is, whether it's about what these jobs pay, which is amazing, and what the reality is on the environmental question on pipelines. What's real and what isn't. There's been so much false information put out for years and years and years on energy, on how we get electricity, how we make things, how we power the lives that we live, and what the truth is about climate change. And, I fully admit Republicans have not been a good player in that conversation until now, right? Because, I think for too long, the conversation was about whether climate change is even happening. And that's not really what the conversation is about anymore. The conversation is much better. It's about what the solutions are to that problem. And so I've laid out a lot of different things to think about throughout this conversation about the existentialism of the premise, right? About this idea that we might go extinct, that we should be scaring children into thinking that, and moving on to what the truth is about that, to what will really work. If our shared goal is less carbon emissions, then the question has to be, how do we reach that goal, and with what kind of technology? And what will work and what won't, and what are the costs associated with that, and what should we be willing to bear, and what aren't you seeing? Just because you don't work in the oil and gas industry, do you realize how this might affect you? Your electricity prices will go up. Your gas prices will go up in California. So generally speaking, you can imagine that the Biden administration wants to nationalize Californian policies. That's a pretty good gauge for what's happening. Well, Californians pay a lot more for their electricity than you do in Texas. About I think 6 times more. At least their growth in electricity prices, I think, is 6 times higher than anywhere else in America. They pay a lot more, and guess what they get for that? They get rolling blackouts constantly still, and it doesn't seem like a good deal. And then the next question is like, are they really reducing emissions in any coherent way? They're closing down multiple nuclear plants in California. So the money is just, if we're gonna spend money, if we're gonna do something, it seems like a much better idea would be to save some of these nuclear plants that are under threat of closing, or invest in modulated nuclear, invest in just better nuclear technology, maybe change the laws so that we can have more highly enriched uranium used in nuclear technology, which makes it more efficient and cheaper. So these are the things we got to be thinking about: carbon capture, carbon sequestration. What is really the enemy here? If the enemy is truly carbon, then let's focus on that and reducing that as the overall solution. And the last thing is, you got to think globally. Just slapping ourselves across the face here in America doesn't change the global conversation, doesn't change energy demand around the world. You have to think globally in order to solve this problem. And, nice agreements in Paris that please a lot of European diplomats ain't going to do the trick. The Chinese don't care. They just don't care. And I know John Kerry wants to believe that they care. They absolutely do not. I mean, they got a cush deal out of that. They can keep emitting as the #1 emitter in the world as a developing country up until 2030. This is not a good deal. This is not a good deal. It doesn't change the trajectory of anything. Doesn't encourage the kind of innovation that we need to fix this. You know, it'd be a lot better building more pipelines, getting natural gas into our export terminals and shipping all that to India and China so that it will outcompete their coal-powered power plants. Yeah, alliteration is hard. And reduce their reliance on coal and reduce emissions massively. If you really want to make an impact, then you need more natural gas in India and China. If Joe Biden really cared about climate change and reducing carbon emissions, that would be the #1 goal. Natural gas in India and China. That's how we would fix this problem. And we would reduce emissions far more than all of this nonsense that unfortunately they've been doing in their first week in office. That's all I got. Thank you all so much for being on Coffee with Crenshaw. Like I said, we'll do this monthly. You know, maybe we'll take suggestions on what kind of themes you want to see. It'll usually just be what's hot at that moment and what affects our district. That's usually the reasons we settle on these topics. Again, Alex, Robert, thank you so much for the work you do and for being on the call with us. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. And we didn't have a high drop-off. Had a lot of people interested in this topic, so thank you. And good to be with y'all. Have a great day.
Thank you.